She wore the emerald dress he once said made her unforgettable. She had reserved the table weeks in advance, ordered his favorite wine, written and rewritten the card in her purse until the words felt honest. 5 years. She had given this man 5 years of her life, and in the time it takes to draw one breath, he looked across the candlelight and said the 7 words that tore everything down. I wish you were never my wife. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit like and drop the name of the city where you're watching. I want to see how far this reaches. Mugged. The reservation was under his name because everything always was. Amara Voss had learned that early in the marriage, not through argument, not through a moment of deliberate cruelty, but through the slow accumulation of 1,000 small surrenders. His name on the lease, his name on the accounts, his name whispered in restaurants before the best table appeared from nowhere, before the sommelier materialized at the elbow with something that cost more than most people's rent. She had gotten used to moving through the world as an extension of Lucien Voss, had convinced herself for long enough that it almost felt true that this was simply how things worked when your husband was the kind of man other men were afraid to look at directly. She had worn the emerald dress on purpose. It hung in the back of the closet, preserved behind a dry cleaning bag, because she didn't reach for it casually. It was the dress from the night they met, a gallery opening 4 years before the wedding, when Lucien had crossed an entire room of powerful, deliberately beautiful people to stop in front of her. He hadn't said she looked stunning. He'd said she looked unforgettable. She had held on to that word for 5 years the way you hold a coin in your pocket for luck, pressing your thumb against it until the edges wear smooth. The restaurant was called Sete, hidden on a side street in the old financial district, no sign outside, just a brass handle on a black door and a maitre d' who knew every face that mattered. Amara had arrived 7 minutes early. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded on the white linen and watched the candle in the center of the table push warm light against the crystal glasses. And she thought, tonight is going to be different. She had been telling herself that for months. Lucien arrived at 8:14. He was not a man who apologized for lateness. Not to her, not to anyone. He appeared in the entrance in a charcoal suit, and the room's energy shifted the way a room always shifted when he walked into it. That invisible recalibration, every peripheral gaze tracking him without wanting to be caught doing it. He was 41 years old and built like a decision that had never been questioned. Dark hair, jaw like something engineered, eyes the specific gray of a sky that has made up its mind to storm. He looked at her across the room, and his expression did not change. That was the first thing she noticed. Not warmth, not the loosening around the eyes that used to happen when he saw her. Nothing. He crossed the room and sat down without touching her, no hand on her shoulder, no press of lips to her temple. He sat and picked up the menu with the focused neutrality of a man reviewing a document. "You look nice," he said, not looking up. "Nice. Not unforgettable." "Thank you." She kept her voice even. "I ordered the Barolo, the 09. I remembered you. I'm not drinking tonight." She put her hands in her lap. The waiter came. Lucien ordered without consulting her, which he always did, and she watched his hands on the leather menu. The scar along the inside of his left forearm, the one he'd told her was from a car accident when he was 19, the one she had stopped believing was from a car accident years ago. His hands were steady. Everything about him was steady. Lucien Voss had never trembled in front of anything in his life, and he was not trembling now. They sat through the first course in near silence. She asked about a business matter she already knew the answer to because it was the kind of conversation he would engage with. He answered in 4 sentences. She asked about his partner, Damon, a man she neither liked nor trusted. Lucien said Damon was handling things. She nodded and cut her food into smaller pieces and did not eat very much of it. The second course arrived. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say during the drive over, in the back of the car with the partition up and the city sliding past the window. She had practiced the tone. Not pleading, not accusatory, just honest. "We have drifted. I feel it, and I think you feel it. I want to find our way back. Simple. Real." 5 years of marriage bought her the right to say that across a dinner table. She was gathering herself for it, was actually opening her mouth, when Lucien set down his fork. He set it down very deliberately, the way a man sets something down when he has already decided what comes next. Amara. Something in the way he said her name closed a door. I need to say something to you. He looked at her fully for the first time since he'd sat down. The storm-gray eyes were calm in a way that frightened her, because she knew what his calm meant. She had been in rooms where men threatened Lucian Voss and watched him become more still, not less. This was that stillness, directed at her. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I owe you honesty. Her chest went tight. Lucian, let me finish. She closed her mouth. This marriage! He paused, not because he was struggling with the words, because he was choosing them with the same precision he applied to everything. I've been carrying it for a while now. Carrying the idea of it because walking away from a marriage is a complicated thing in my world, and I wasn't ready to deal with complicated. He looked at the candle flame between them. But I'm done not being honest. She could hear her own heartbeat. The restaurant around them continued, low music, silverware on porcelain, the murmur of other people's ordinary evenings, and she sat inside it like a woman behind glass, watching the world proceed without her. I wish you were never my wife. She heard it. She understood each individual word. She simply could not arrange them into a sentence that made sense, because sentences had to be logical, and this was not logical. This was the man she had built a life around, the man she had reorganized her entire selfhood to accommodate, and he was looking at her across 5 years and a white linen tablecloth and saying he wished none of it had happened. I don't... Her voice came out wrong, smaller than she intended. I don't understand what you... I'm tired, Amara. Flat, final. I'm tired of this, of the routine, of coming home to the same quiet, of pretending this is what I want. He picked his fork back up, which was almost the worst part, the normalcy of it, the gesture that said this conversation was not, for him, catastrophic. I should have said it a year ago. I didn't. That's on me. She became very conscious of the dress, the emerald dress she had chosen like a prayer, an offering, a reminder. You called me unforgettable. She felt it against her skin as something humiliating now, her hope made visible and irrelevant. Is there someone else? She hadn't meant it as a question. It had come out flat. Lucian's jaw shifted. That was all. That was enough. Her hand moved without her deciding to move it. Across the table, to his jacket pocket, where she had noticed the edge of his phone showing when he sat down. He caught her wrist. His grip was controlled and immediate, the grip of a man with very good reflexes. Don't, he said. Then tell me the truth. She looked at him. Tell me to my face. A long silence. He released her wrist. He reached into his pocket himself and placed the phone on the table between them. He looked at her for one moment and then looked away, and that was its own kind of answer. She picked it up. The lock screen. She knew his code, had never used it without permission, had never felt the need to, had trusted him with a completeness that now felt like the most dangerous thing she had ever done. She entered the 4 digits and the screen opened. She saw the name first. Serafina. A contact with no last name, which was already its own story. She opened the thread and the messages came up in a scroll that seemed to have no beginning. Hundreds of them, months of them, the accumulated weight of an entire hidden life. She did not read them. She could not read them. She scrolled up and saw a photograph that Serafina had sent, a selfie in what was clearly the suite at the Aldermore Hotel on the north side of the city, the suite Amara knew because Lucian used it for client meetings, had told her he used it for client meetings. She put the phone down on the tablecloth. She was very still. Her breath was coming in a shallow, controlled pattern, the kind of breathing you do when you are concentrating very hard on not becoming something uncontrollable. She pressed her palms flat on the table. She was aware of other diners nearby. She was aware of herself in the emerald dress and the specific absurdity of the candle still burning between them like this was still a romantic anniversary dinner. How long? She said. Amara, how long? 8 months. He said it quietly. 8 months. She had spent 8 months sleeping beside a man who was 8 months into another woman's bed and she had not known, had made dinner reservations, had preserved the emerald dress, had been rehearsing We Have Drifted. I want to find our way back. Get out, she said. We should... Do not. Her voice came from somewhere she hadn't accessed before, some lower register, something without softness in it. Do not sit here and tell me what we should do. You have been lying to me for 8 months in my own marriage. You don't get to manage this. She looked at him. Get out. Lucian Voss, the man who controlled crime routes across 4 districts, who had sat across tables from people who wanted him dead and ordered dessert anyway, looked at his wife, and for 1 second, one almost imperceptible second, something flickered behind the storm-gray eyes. Then it was gone. He stood, straightened his jacket, picked up his phone from the tablecloth. We'll talk when you've had time to leave. He left. She sat alone at the anniversary table with 2 barely touched plates and a Barolo she'd spent 40 minutes selecting and the candle burning lower between 2 crystal glasses. And she did not cry. She would not cry here, in Sete, where everyone knew Lucian's name. She would not give this room the performance of her grief. She sat for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the slim hand of the watch on her wrist, a birthday gift from Lucian, platinum case, which she would notice later and think about differently. She sat and breathed and let the shock move through her like a current finding ground. And when it had passed through the worst of its voltage, she opened her clutch and removed $200 bills and placed them precisely in the center of the tablecloth and stood up. The maitre d' appeared. Mrs. Voss, shall I call me a car, please? She said it without looking at him and walked out through the black door into the night air, and the cold hit her like something honest. She called her sister from the sidewalk. Raven picked up on the second ring, which was always how it was with Raven. Present, immediate, the one reliable thing. Hey, how's the... I need you to come get me. Amar's voice was steady. She was still making it be steady. I'm outside Sete, on Clement Street. A pause. Raven was good at reading pauses. Amara, what happened? Please just come. She stood outside in the emerald dress with her clutch under her arm and her shoulders back, and she watched the city move around her. Cabs, a couple walking with a dog, a man on a phone, everyone in the middle of their own ordinary Thursday evening. And she held herself together with both hands on the inside because that was all she had right now, her own hands, and they were going to have to be enough. Raven arrived in 19 minutes. She got out of the car before it had fully stopped and covered the sidewalk in 6 fast strides and wrapped both arms around her sister, and Amara stood inside that embrace for exactly as long as she could, which was not long because if she stayed in it, she would come apart, and she was not ready to come apart. Get in the car, Amara said. I'll tell you on the way. She told Raven the outline of it, the words, the phone, the photograph in the hotel suite, the 8 months, the calm way he had stood and straightened his jacket and picked up his phone like she was a meeting that had run long. Raven drove and said almost nothing, which was correct, which was the right response because there were no words that were useful yet. Raven understood that. They pulled up to Raven's building on the north side, the 4th-floor apartment with the window that faced the park, and Amara got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk one more time, and she looked up at the dark sky above the city because she needed a moment with something large and impersonal before she went inside. The anger was coming. She could feel it gathering the way weather gathers. First a change in pressure, then the smell of something electric, then the sky going the wrong color. It was not here yet. What was here was something colder and more dangerous than anger. Clarity. She was the wife of Lucian Voss. She had access to 5 years of financial records, joint accounts, property portfolios, the investment vehicles he had built partly with capital from her family's inheritance, which she had never explicitly counted as leverage, and which he had never explicitly asked for, which was exactly the kind of arrangement that looked in retrospect like a man who had planned ahead. She thought about the hotel suite. 8 months? The things that were paid for in 8 months. Rooms, gifts, dinners, plane tickets possibly, all of it flowing from accounts she had co-signed. She thought about the name. Serafina. She thought about Lucian's face when he placed the phone on the tablecloth. Not ashamed, not destroyed, just ready. The way a man is ready when he has already decided what comes next and has simply been waiting for the correct moment to execute it. He had expected her to cry. He had expected her to beg, or rage, or shatter in some way he could manage and move past. She had seen it in the set of his shoulders when he stood up, the specific posture of a man who believes he has already handled something difficult and can now walk away from the wreckage. He had forgotten something fundamental about the woman he had chosen to betray. She had survived 5 years beside the most dangerous man in the city without flinching. She had sat across from his enemies and smiled. She had held her silence in rooms where the wrong word could end careers, or worse. She had built herself into something that could withstand his world, and she had done it quietly, without credit, because that was what the world behind his world required. He had seen her silence as submission. He had no idea what she had been building inside it. Raven touched her elbow. "Come inside, you're shaking." Amara looked at her own hands. Her sister was right. There was a fine, almost invisible tremor, the body processing what the mind was still organizing. She looked at it with something close to clinical interest, because she would need her hands to be steady for what was coming. Not tonight. Tonight she would allow herself to collapse. But starting tomorrow, she would need every part of herself in working order. "Raven," she looked at her sister, "do you still have Adrian Mercer's number?" Raven went very still. Adrian Mercer was a divorce attorney. Not just any divorce attorney, the one who had handled the Delacroix case 2 years ago, the one where a woman with far fewer resources than Amara had walked away from a marriage to an even more powerful man with her financial future intact and her safety guaranteed. He was the attorney people called when they were done with being afraid. "Why do you have that name already memorized?" Raven asked quietly. Amara had been carrying it for 2 months. Written on a card she kept folded inside a book on her nightstand, a book Lucian would never open because he did not read the kind of books she kept. She had not planned to use it. She had simply wanted to know it was there, the way you want to know where the exit is even if you're not going to leave. "Yes," Raven said, "I have it." Amara nodded once. She turned back toward the building entrance and walked toward it with her spine straight and the emerald dress moving quietly around her legs and the city noise behind her. And if Lucian Voss could have seen her face in that moment, not the face from the restaurant, not the controlled blankness she had held across the white linen, but this face, right now, in the cold air outside her sister's building, he would have recognized something he had seen before. It was the same expression he wore when a decision had been made and the only thing left was the execution. He was not the only person in the marriage who knew how to end something cleanly. He had simply assumed, because she had always been quiet, that she did not know how. Inside the apartment, her phone buzzed. She did not look at it, but when she finally did, 20 minutes later, sitting at Raven's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, she found 3 missed calls from Lucian and a text message that read, "We need to talk about this like adults. Come home." She set the phone face down on the table. She thought about the hotel suite photograph. She thought about 8 months. She thought about the platinum watch on her wrist and the joint accounts and the investment vehicles and the name Serafina sitting in his phone without a last name, which meant he had saved it that way deliberately. And she thought about all of it with the cold and meticulous attention of a woman who is very finished with being underestimated. She was going to need more than Adrian Mercer. She was going to need to know exactly where every dollar of their shared life had gone for the past 8 months. And she was going to need that information before Lucian realized she was looking for it. And she was going to need to move faster than a man who had spent a decade learning how to make things disappear. She reached for the phone, not to call Lucian back. She opened her contacts and scrolled until she found a name she hadn't used in 3 years. Marcus Webb, a forensic accountant she had met at a charity event. A quiet, careful man who had once told her, at that event, that if she ever needed someone to find money that was trying not to be found, she should not hesitate to call. She had thought, at the time, that he was being professionally theoretical. She tapped his name. Marcus Webb picked up on the 4th ring, which meant he had looked at the caller ID and decided whether or not to answer. "Mrs. Voss." His voice was the same as she remembered. Measured, unhurried. The voice of a man who understood that information was currency and never spent it carelessly. "It's late." "I know what time it is." She kept her voice low. Raven had gone into the kitchen to give her the room, but walls in older apartments were thin. "I need someone who can find money, the kind that's been moved carefully." A pause that was not surprise. Webb was not a man who was surprised easily, but assessment. What's the timeline? 8 months back, possibly longer. Joint accounts? Yes. And some separate structures I may not have full visibility on. Business entities. I need to know what I don't know. Another pause. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line, heard what might have been a chair adjusting, a man settling into a professional mode he had not expected to need at this hour. This is a domestic matter. It will be. My rate is... I know your rate. She had looked it up 2 months ago when she first folded Adrian Mercer's card into the book on the nightstand. She had been thorough, even then. Can you start this week? I can start tomorrow, Webb said. Send me everything you have access to. Account numbers, entity names, anything with his signature on it. I'll find the rest. She ended the call and sat with the phone in both hands and the untouched tea going cold on the table in front of her, and she allowed herself exactly 60 seconds of stillness. Not peace, not rest, but the functional pause of a person who has just committed to a direction and needs to let the decision settle into the body before the body can begin moving with purpose. Then she got up and went to find her sister. Raven was standing at the kitchen counter, not doing anything, just standing there with her arms crossed, and her expression carrying the specific tension of someone who has been waiting to be needed and is trying not to rush toward it. She was 2 years younger than Amara and had never married and had spent most of her adult life making herself useful to people who underestimated her, which meant she and her sister were more similar than either of them usually acknowledged out loud. I called Marcus Webb, Amara said. Raven said nothing for a moment. Then, the accountant from the Whitmore event. Yes. So you're already... Raven stopped, recalibrated. How long have you been planning this? I haven't been planning it. Amara pulled out a chair and sat down, because her legs were beginning to register the evening. I've been preparing for the possibility. There's a difference. Raven looked at her with an expression that was partly admiration and partly grief. The combination of emotions a person has when they realize someone they love has been suffering more carefully than they let on. Amara, how long have you known something was wrong? Longer than 8 months. The kitchen was quiet. Why didn't you Because knowing and being able to prove it are two different things. And because I kept thinking... She stopped, pressed her fingers against her eyes. It doesn't matter what I kept thinking. Raven crossed the room and sat across from her. She did not reach out. She understood when her sister needed space to be in the same room with her own damage without someone trying to fix it. That was the thing about Raven. She always knew the difference between being present and being an intrusion. What do you need from me? A place to stay while I get organized. You have it. And I need you to not tell anyone where I am. Not mutual friends. Not... She looked at her sister directly. Not anyone who might mention it to someone connected to Lucian's circle. Raven's jaw tightened. I would never. I know. I'm saying it anyway because I need to hear myself say it. She lowered her hands. Her face felt tight, the specific tightness of prolonged controlled expression, the kind that left a dull ache along the jaw. He is going to come here. Probably tomorrow. Maybe tonight. Let him come. He's not a man you open the door to when he's decided he wants something. Raven met her eyes. He's also not a man I'm afraid of. Amara was not sure that was entirely wise, but she was also not in a position to argue it. Lucian was not going to hurt Raven. He was too calculated for that. Hurting her sister would be messy, traceable, and more importantly, it would be an admission that he had lost control of the situation, and Lucian Voss had spent his entire adult life refusing to admit he had lost control of anything. She borrowed clothes from Raven's drawer and took the guest room and lay flat on her back on the narrow bed in the dark, still in her borrowed clothes because she had not been able to make herself sleep in the emerald dress and had folded it over the chair in the corner with a precision that was almost violence. And she stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a very long time. The anger arrived at approximately 2 a.m. without warning, the way the body sometimes waits until the adrenaline has metabolized before it allows the thing underneath to surface. She was lying in the dark, and then suddenly, she was not lying still. She was sitting up with her hands gripping the edge of the mattress and her chest working too hard, the breath coming in short, hard pulls, because she had just thought of a specific thing, the suite at the Aldermore Hotel. She had been there. She had been there 6 months ago, in December, when Lucian had said he needed to use it for a meeting with a supplier from the West Coast. He had mentioned it casually at breakfast. She had said, "Okay, will you be late?" He had said, "Probably." She had made dinner for herself that evening and eaten it alone and read for a while and gone to sleep. Normal evening. Unremarkable Thursday. 6 months ago. 2 months into the 8 months. She sat in the dark of Raven's guest room and breathed through it, the precise, nauseating calculation of all the evenings like that one. All the casually mentioned meetings and slightly late returns and unremarkable Thursdays, and she let the anger do what it needed to do, let it burn through the shock's remaining residue, because she needed it gone by morning. She needed to be cold by morning. Lucian arrived at 10:17 the next day. Amara knew it was him from the sound of the knock. Unhurried, but heavy, the knock of a man who did not expect to wait long. She was sitting at Raven's kitchen table with her laptop open and a legal pad beside it, and she did not get up. She heard Raven cross the living room and open the door. "Lucian," Raven's voice, flat, giving him nothing. "I need to speak with Amara." "She's busy." "Raven." His voice had the quality of someone choosing patience because it was the more efficient strategy. "I'm not asking. And I'm not asking you to come in." A beat. "She'll call you when she's ready to talk to you." Silence from the doorway. Amara could picture him exactly. The set of the jaw, the controlled stillness, the process of calculating whether this particular door was worth forcing, and what it would cost him if he was wrong. Lucian was many things. Impulsive was not one of them. "Tell her I called an attorney." Raven said nothing. "Tell her the right approach is to handle this as adults, with representation on both sides, and that I have no interest in making this ugly." "I'll tell her you were here," Raven said. The door closed. Amara had not moved during any of it. She listened to Raven's footsteps cross back through the living room and into the kitchen, and she kept her eyes on the laptop screen where she was drafting a list of every joint account she had access to, every property she had knowledge of, every entity name she had heard mentioned at dinners or seen on correspondence she was not supposed to have noticed. Raven stood in the kitchen doorway. "He says he has a lawyer." "I heard. He wants to handle it like adults." "I heard that too." She did not look up from the screen. "He means he wants to set the terms before I understand what the terms are worth." Raven was quiet for a moment. "Adrian Mercer," she finally said. "I'll get you the number." Adrian Mercer's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the legal district, with a waiting room that was entirely beige and designed to communicate the specific message that the people who worked here were focused entirely on substance and had no interest in impressing you with aesthetics. Amara liked it immediately. She sat in one of the beige chairs the following afternoon and waited 18 minutes before the door opened and Adrian Mercer appeared. He was smaller than she had expected. Mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up on his head, a jacket that had seen many long days. He looked like a man who had been in more difficult rooms than this one and had never once lost his composure in any of them. He shook her hand. "Mrs. Voss, come in." "Whitfield," she said. "I'll be going back to Whitfield. You can start there." He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has seen many versions of this meeting and has just determined that this one is going to be in a different category. "Come in, Ms. Whitfield." He listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. She gave him the outline, the marriage, the duration, the announcement at set, the phone, and the 8 months, and the name Serafina Vale, the Aldermore Hotel, and the financial structures she suspected had been used. She gave him Marcus Webb's name, because a good attorney needed to know what resources were already in play. When she finished, Mercer took his glasses off the top of his head and put them on and looked at the legal pad he had been filling in precise small handwriting. "You said you had some access to joint financial records." "Yes." "Before he realizes you're looking." "That is the window, yes." He tapped the pen against the pad. "His attorney. Do you know who he's using?" "He mentioned last night that he'd retained someone. I don't have a name yet." "I can find out." He was already writing. "If it's Garrison, that changes the playbook slightly. Garrison is aggressive on asset concealment, which means we move on the financial discovery faster than normal. He looked up. Miss Whitfield, I need to ask you something directly. Please. Are you certain you want to do this? Not because I think you shouldn't. I think your position is defensible and potentially very strong. But your husband's world. He said it carefully. Not with fear, with the precision of a man making sure he understands the complete picture. There are dynamics that aren't. I am certain, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once and went back to the legal pad. Then we begin. The call from Lucian came 3 days after Raven's door. Amara had been expecting it. Not the door visit, not the texts, but the real call. The one where he used the tone of voice that had always worked before. The one that was not quite warm and not quite commanding, but was precisely calibrated to the territory between them. The tone that said, I know you. I know how to reach you. Let's stop this. She answered it. We need to sit down, Lucian said. No greeting. Which was its own message. They were past the performance of formality, apparently, in his view. My attorney will be in touch with yours. A pause. Then, is that how you want to do this? It's how we're doing this. Amara. The voice shifted. Not softer. That was too simple. More deliberate. I understand you're angry. What I did was... He stopped. She could hear him choosing. I handled it badly. I should have told you before that night. You should have not done it at all. Yes. He said it without hesitation, which surprised her, and she hated that it surprised her, hated that even now some part of her was still calibrated to his admissions in a way that registered them as meaningful. That's also true. But I need you to understand that what I want from this settlement is something that works for both of us. I'm not trying to... Lucian. She kept her voice even. Stop talking to me like I don't know what I'm doing. Silence. You put Serafina in the Aldermore. I know what that suite costs per night. I have access to records going back to the beginning of our marriage. She paused. Let that settle. I know where the money moved. I know which entities it moved through. And in approximately 10 days, I will have documentation of all of it. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This one had weight. She could hear him thinking, could almost hear the internal recalculation, the reassessment of what he had believed this conversation would be when he placed the call. You've been talking to an accountant, he said. Not a question. My attorney will be in touch, she said. Please don't call this number again. She ended the call. Her hand was shaking slightly when she set the phone down, and she looked at it with the same clinical attention she had given it outside Raven's building, observing, not judging, the body processing ahead of the mind. She pressed her palm flat on the table until the tremor stopped. Marcus Webb came through 5 days later. He called in the afternoon and she took the call at Raven's kitchen table with a notepad ready, and he walked her through what he had found in the tone of a man reading a building inspection report. Factual, unhurried, precise in a way that was somehow more devastating than any emotional register would have been. 8 months of financial movement through 3 separate entities, 2 of which Amara had never known existed. A limited liability company formed 18 months ago, ostensibly a consulting structure through which Lucian had been running personal expenditures. Hotel stays totaling 41 nights at properties across the city and in 2 other cities. Jewelry purchases through a private dealer on the west side. Amara noted that Webb quoted the total figure without emphasis, which meant he had learned to report numbers without inflection because inflection helped no one. Transfer of funds from a joint investment vehicle that Amara had contributed to with inherited capital. Not all of it. Enough. There's one more thing, Webb said, and the slight change in his voice made her grip the pen harder. The LLC has a co-director. It's not Serafina Vale. Amara said nothing, waiting. It's a man named Harlan Cross. He's listed as a business associate. Webb paused. He's also the brother of your husband's current attorney. She set the pen down. Harlan Cross. She knew that name. Had heard it at 2 or 3 gatherings in Lucian's world, peripheral figure, someone described as handling logistics, which in Lucian's world was a word with a wide range of meanings. She had filed the name without context and moved on, the way you move through a room full of names that don't yet require your attention. They required it now. Webb, she said carefully. How long has this LLC been active? 18 months. She did the math. 18 months ago, she and Lucian had been fine, or what she had understood to be fine. They had been at a benefit together. She remembered the suit he wore. She remembered a conversation at that event about a potential property investment he wanted her to co-sign. She had co-signed. 2 months later, this entity had been formed. Was the investment property? Yes, Webb said before she could finish. The capital from that property is one of the inflows. She sat very still. She had signed her name to a document that had fed, indirectly, the structure Lucian used to fund an affair. She had been, without her knowledge, a financial participant in her own betrayal. The specific ugliness of that took a moment to locate a place in her chest where it could sit, because none of the existing categories quite fit it. It was not quite anger, not quite humiliation, but something that occupied the territory between them and had serrated edges. Send me everything, she said. Every document, every record, every transaction. Send it to Adrian Mercer's office directly and copy me. Already prepared, Webb said. And Webb. She picked up the pen again. Thank you. She ended the call and sat in the silence of Raven's kitchen and thought about Harlan Cross, about the attorney whose brother had helped build the structure, about the timing of the LLC relative to the investment property, about the way Lucian had asked her to co-sign that document at a benefit 18 months ago with the easy confidence of a man who considered it already decided. She had thought, at the time, that he was asking her. She understood now that he had been using her. The distinction was not abstract. It had a dollar amount attached to it, and the dollar amount was in Webb's documentation. And Webb's documentation was on its way to Adrian Mercer, and Adrian Mercer was about to understand the full shape of what Lucian Voss had built. She was reaching for her phone to call Mercer when the door buzzer sounded. Raven was not home. She had gone to work because life continued regardless, because bills did not pause for the unraveling of marriages. Amar crossed to the intercom panel. Who is it? A voice she did not recognize, male, younger than Lucian, carrying the specific flatness of someone who has been sent rather than come of their own accord. Ms. Whitfield, Mr. Voss asked me to deliver something. She looked at the intercom panel for a moment. Then she pressed the button. Leave it with the building manager. Ma'am, he said. Building manager, she repeated, and released the button. She moved to the window that faced the street and looked down. A man in a dark jacket stood on the sidewalk below, looking up at the building with a padded envelope in one hand and a phone in the other. While she watched, he raised the phone and appeared to dial. 30 seconds later, her phone rang. Lucian. She did not answer. He called twice more in the following 4 minutes. She watched the man on the sidewalk below receive what appeared to be instructions, watched him look up at the building one more time, watched him eventually walk back toward a car idling at the curb and get in. She kept watching the car. It did not leave immediately. It sat at the curb for 9 minutes before pulling away. She wrote down the make and partial plate number out of habit, out of 5 years of living beside a man who had taught her, without meaning to, that information collected in advance of needing it was always better than scrambling for it after. She called Mercer. Webb's sending everything over, she said when he answered. There's an LLC, $2.5 million in traceable movement, possibly more. And Lucian's attorney has a familial connection to one of the co-directors. She could hear Mercer's pen moving. That's a conflict of interest issue, potentially. I thought so. This changes the filing strategy. We need to move the initial petition this week, before his side has time to restructure anything. A pause. Ms. Whitfield, I want you to be prepared for escalation. When we file, it will not be quiet. His response will not be measured. Men like your husband do not respond to a legal process the way, I understand what kind of man he is, she said. Then you understand the next phase is not going to be careful conversations about settlements. His voice was level. He is going to attempt to discredit the financial claims. He will use his attorney to challenge the evidence chain. He may attempt to contact people in your circle, friends, family, to gather information or to apply pressure. And he will almost certainly not accept, initially, that this is actually happening. Amara looked at the street below where the car had been. He already sent someone. Mercer went quiet for a moment. Today? 20 minutes ago. I didn't open the door. Good. Don't. She could hear something shifting in his tone. Not alarm, but a heightening of attention. From now on, log every contact, time, method, content if you have it, names of anyone who appears, vehicle descriptions. He paused. Do you feel safe where you are? She thought about that honestly. Lucian would not touch her. That was not who he was and not what this was. But safe was a word with layers. For now, she said, keep me informed of any change in that answer. She ended the call and stood at the window for another moment, and then she went back to the kitchen table and sat down and opened her laptop and returned to the list she had been building. The complete financial anatomy of 5 years of marriage, rendered in the clear, unsparing language of documentation, stripped of all the ways she had once understood it, which was as a life, shared, built, worth preserving. It was not that anymore. It was evidence. 2 days later, at 11 in the morning, in a beige office on the 14th floor, Adrian Mercer filed the petition for divorce from Lucian Voss. By 3 in the afternoon, Lucian appeared at Raven's building in person. He did not buzz from the street this time. He was already inside. Had used his influence with someone in the building, she would learn later, a contact who owed him a favor, because Lucian's city was built on favors owed and collected, an invisible network of obligation that opened doors that should have stayed closed. The knock on the apartment door was the same as before, unhurried, heavy. Amara stood in the kitchen and looked at the door and felt, for the first time since the restaurant, the specific weight of being in a small space with the architecture of her fear. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of what it cost to hold ground against a man who had never experienced ground being held against him. She walked to the door. She did not open it. Lucian. Through the door, steady. Open the door, Amara. Not angry. Worse than angry. Quiet. The quiet that meant he had moved past the phase of strategic patience into something more direct. We're communicating through our attorneys now. I'm not interested in attorneys right now. A pause. I'm interested in talking to my wife. I'm not your wife anymore. You said so yourself. Silence. Amara. His voice shifted, and she felt it. In the jaw, in the chest, the specific frequency of Lucian Voss when he stopped performing control and allowed something real to surface. And the terrible thing was that even now, even after all of it, her body knew that frequency, knew it, and responded to it. I made a mistake. I know that. But what you're doing right now, what you're doing with Mercer, with whoever you've had in our accounts, this isn't just a divorce. You understand what you're setting in motion. Yes, she said. I do. If those records go public, then they go public. Amara. Now the edge appeared. There are aspects of my business that cannot survive public financial examination. You know that. You have always known that. And if you expose those structures, you are not only hurting me, you are opening your own liability. She said it through the door, flat and precise. I know, I've known for 5 years. And you should ask yourself why in all of that time you never considered what it would mean if I stopped protecting you from it. The silence that followed was the longest yet. She stood on her side of the door with her hand flat against the painted wood, and her heart moving faster than she wanted it to, and she waited for whatever came next, because she had just said the thing that could not be unsaid, had just made explicit the leverage that she had been carrying without naming it since the moment she sat down at Raven's kitchen table. And now it was in the air between them, and they both knew the shape of it. When he spoke again, his voice was different, controlled in a new way. The control of a man who has just recalculated the cost of what he thought was going to be a manageable loss and found that it is not manageable at all. We are not done talking about this, he said. No, she agreed. We're not. She stepped back from the door and listened to his footsteps cross the hall and reach the elevator. And she stood in the quiet apartment with her hand still raised slightly, not quite in a fist. And she thought about 5 years and $2.5 million, and a co-director named Harlan Cross, and an attorney with a conflict of interest, and a woman named Serafina Vale, who had spent 8 months in hotel suites that Amara had unknowingly helped pay for. She thought about all of it, and she thought about the fact that Lucian had just, for the first time since she had known him, left a room without the last word. and she understood, with a certainty that settled in the bones rather than the mind, that whatever this had been before today, it was something different now. The elevator doors closed, and Amara stood in the apartment hallway listening to the mechanical descent, counting floors by instinct, and when the sound stopped, she exhaled slowly through her nose and went back inside and locked the deadbolt with both hands. Her phone was already lighting up on the kitchen table. Not Lucian this time. Mercer. She picked it up. "I was going to call you." He just filed a counter-response. Mercer's voice had the quality of a man who had been on the phone continuously for the past 3 hours and had not yet had the chance to be troubled by that. "Faster than I expected. His attorney is Garrison, after all. Daniel Garrison, which confirms the Harlan Cross connection we discussed. They've filed a counter-petition challenging the asset claims, and they've attached an affidavit." She pulled out a chair and sat down. "What kind of affidavit?" "Lucian is claiming that you had full knowledge of the LLC structure, that you were informed of the business entities at the time of formation and gave verbal consent to the capital movement." A pause. "He has a document, Amara, a signature page from the investment property closing 18 months ago. His attorneys are arguing that the notations on that document constitute implicit consent to the broader financial arrangement." She sat very still. She remembered the closing. A conference room downtown, a Tuesday afternoon, a stack of documents she had reviewed carefully because she was not a woman who signed things she had not read. She remembered the attorney at that closing, not Garrison, a different man, younger, someone Lucian had introduced as a real estate specialist. She remembered reading the primary document, the property deed, the mortgage instrument, the standard closing package. She remembered signing where she was directed to sign. She did not remember a notation about any LLC. "Send me the document," she said. "Already sent. Check your email." She heard him turning pages. "There's one more thing. The affidavit has a second section. Lucian is claiming that the financial transfers were not concealment. He's saying they were part of a business arrangement you knew about, that your contribution of inherited capital was made with your explicit knowledge that it would fund multiple business structures, and that your decision to involve forensic accounting is an attempt to misrepresent a known arrangement as financial deception." She opened her laptop with one hand, the phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. Her email was loading. "He's saying I knew. He's saying you participated." "That's a lie." "I know that." Mercer's voice was level. "But he has a document with your signature on it that his attorneys are going to spend considerable time making look like evidence of something you approved. This is Garrison's specialty. He doesn't win cases by finding truth. He wins them by manufacturing enough ambiguity that the truth becomes expensive and exhausting to prove." The email appeared. She clicked the attachment and the document opened on her screen, and she leaned forward and read it with the focused attention she had once given to every contract that crossed her desk before she stopped having a desk of her own, before she became the person who read Lucian's correspondence and not her own. She found it on page 4. Third paragraph from the bottom, inserted between a standard indemnification clause and the signature block. 9 lines of dense legal language that, read quickly and without specific knowledge to flag it, could be processed as boilerplate. Read carefully. With the knowledge that someone had put it there deliberately, it constituted something far more deliberate. It referenced a business development arrangement. It used the phrase associated capital structures. It had her signature 2 lines below it, and the slot labeled spouse acknowledgement, directly above Lucian's signature on the primary line. She had signed a document she believed was a property closing. She had, without knowing it, signed something else. Mercer. Her voice was very controlled. The attorney at that closing, the one Lucian brought. His name was... She reached back through 18 months of memory. Calloway. He said his name was Calloway. "I'm already looking." She could hear him typing. "Give me a moment." She looked at page 4 of the document and at her own signature and felt something cold move through her that was not quite any emotion she had a word for. It was the feeling of understanding, with full clarity, that she had been outmaneuvered before the game she thought she was playing had even begun. That Lucian had not simply had an affair and gotten caught. He had constructed, methodically and in advance, the architecture of his own defense. The LLC, the closing document, the signature, Harlan Cross, his brother's attorney. These were not improvisations. These were the work of a man who had understood, long before Amara reached for his phone at the restaurant, that this day would come. He had not been surprised at set. He had been ready. "Calloway," Mercer said, "there's no licensed attorney by that name associated with the property." The closing was conducted by a man named Drew Parrish, who is a licensed notary but not a practicing attorney, and who has, in the past 14 months, signed notarizations on 11 other documents connected to entities in Lucian's business network. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. He brought a notary and introduced him as an attorney. That's what it looks like. So I signed a document I was not properly advised on at a closing conducted by a man who misrepresented his credentials in the presence of my husband, who knew exactly what the document said. Yes. She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and held them there. The apartment around her was completely quiet, except for the distant sound of the city through the closed window and the sound of her own breathing, which she was monitoring now the way she monitored everything, carefully, so it did not get away from her. "How bad is this?" she said. Not a question she wanted to ask, a question she needed the answer to. Mercer was quiet for a moment, which told her more than any immediate answer would have. "It complicates the financial claim significantly. If Garrison argues successfully that you had constructive knowledge of the capital structures, it doesn't eliminate the infidelity claims, but it severely weakens the financial misconduct argument. The transfers start to look like shared business decisions rather than concealment and theft." He paused. "It also changes the discovery burden. We now have to prove a negative, that you did not know, rather than simply presenting evidence of what he did. Can we prove it? We can try, but it will require deposing Parrish, which Garrison will resist, and it will take time. And in the interim, Lucian's side will use the ambiguity to—" "Mercer," she cut him off, not with anger, with the particular flatness of someone conserving energy. "Tell me what I need to do. Don't speak to Lucian directly. Don't speak to anyone connected to him. Compile every written communication you have received from him regarding the investment property, texts, emails, any physical correspondence. And if there is anyone who was present in conversations where that closing was discussed, anyone who heard him describe it to you as a property purchase only, I need their names by tomorrow morning." She thought. Who had been present? Who had heard Lucian describe that investment? They had discussed it at dinner the week before signing. She remembered that, remembered the specific conversation, remembered Raven sitting across the table because it had been one of those dinners, the 3 of them, a Tuesday. Raven had been there. "My sister," she said. She heard him describe it, the week before the signing. He called it a property investment, nothing else. "Call her tonight. Get her account in writing, sent everything she remembers, details, date, location, what exactly he said." A pause. "Is there anyone else?" She thought harder. Other conversations. She and Lucian had spoken about it one other time. At a benefit, she was almost certain, early that fall. They had been standing near the back of the room, and she had asked about the timeline, and he had said something about the closing being scheduled and described it as straightforward. There had been a woman nearby, someone she knew, a passing acquaintance who had said something about property investments being a good hedge. "Lauren Hayes," she said, almost to herself. She had met Lauren Hayes at 3 separate events in Lucian's world. The woman was a business strategist, sharp and self-contained, someone who had navigated her own career path through rooms full of powerful men and had emerged somehow with her integrity intact. They had exchanged numbers at some point. Amara was not certain they were friends exactly, but they were something. 2 women in similar rooms who had recognized something similar in each other. Lauren had been standing nearby at that benefit. "I'll reach out," Amara said. "I'm not certain she heard enough to matter, but I'll find out." "Good. I'll handle the filing response for now. We have 72 hours before we need to formally answer Garrison's challenge." He stopped. "Amara, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that Lucian has more documents. This may not be the only one." She said nothing for a moment. "I understand. Get some sleep." She ended the call and put the phone on the table and looked at her own signature on page 4 of the document on her laptop screen, and the anger she had been holding in careful check for the past week finally cracked through the discipline. Not explosively, not in any way that would have been visible to someone watching, but internally, a structural shift, the way a building doesn't collapse all at once, but first loses one crucial load-bearing point. She had trusted him. Not blindly. She had never been a woman who trusted blindly, had always read the contracts, had always verified. But she had trusted him in the specific way you trust someone you have chosen to build a life beside. The trust that exists not in the absence of doubt, but in the decision to proceed despite it. And he had used that trust as a construction material, had built her signature into the foundation of his own defense, had brought a man to a closing and called him an attorney and watched her read the document and watched her sign it and said nothing. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up and went to the window and called Raven. Raven arrived home 40 minutes later to find Amara at the kitchen table with the laptop open and a legal pad covered in notes in her small, precise handwriting. Amara walked her through the document, page 4, the 9 lines, what they appeared to mean, and what Mercer believed Garrison intended to do with them. Raven listened without interrupting, which was difficult for her. She was not by nature a woman who sat quietly through information that made her angry, but she held it together until Amara finished. "He had you sign it," Raven said, "without telling me what it was." At a closing where the attorney wasn't actually an attorney. Correct. Raven pushed back from the table and stood up and crossed to the window in one movement and stood there with her back to the room, her shoulders tight, and Amara watched her work through it because that was what Raven needed. Space to process the fury before she could be useful. It took about 40 seconds. "The benefit," Raven said, turning back, "that fall. You asked him about the closing timeline. You remember it?" "I remember it because I thought it was odd how he described it. He said it was a standard property structure. I remember thinking that was a strange phrase, but I didn't know enough to question it." Her jaw was set hard. "I'll write down everything I remember, every word." "Mercer needs it by morning," Raven nodded. She sat back down and reached for the legal pad and a pen. She paused. "Amara, if he built all of this in advance..." She stopped, chose the words. "How much of everything was a setup? How far back does this go?" Amara had been sitting with that question for the past 3 hours. She did not have an answer that felt complete, which was its own kind of answer. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think further back than 8 months." The following morning brought 2 things simultaneously. The first was a text from Lauren Hayes responding to Amara's message from the night before. Lauren had heard enough of the benefit conversation to remember the phrase property investment only, had in fact noted at the time that Lucian had been unusually specific in how he described the deal's simplicity to his wife. She agreed to provide a written account. She also, at the end of the text, added 4 words that Amara read twice before understanding fully. "Call me. There's more." The second was a call from Mercer's associate, a young woman named Petra, who handled communications with the same brisk competence Amara had noticed on her first visit to the office. Petra informed her that Garrison had filed a supplementary motion attached to the counter-petition, requesting a court order to restrict Amara's access to any joint financial accounts pending the resolution of the asset ownership dispute. If the motion was granted, she would have no access to liquid assets from the joint accounts while the case proceeded, which could take months. Which Garrison knew could take months. She called Mercer immediately. "I've seen it," he said, already in motion. "We'll contest it. But Amara, I need you to do something today, before end of business. Any joint accounts you have direct access to. Check whether there have been any movements in the past 48 hours. She pulled up the bank portal on her laptop. The joint checking account, the savings vehicle, the brokerage account that was technically held in both names. She went through them one by one, and her hand slowed on the keyboard when she reached the brokerage. 3 days ago, a transfer. An amount she could not account for moved to an external account she did not recognize. Not the full balance, not even close. Enough to be significant, small enough to avoid automatic flagging under standard monitoring thresholds. "Mercer," her voice was very flat. "He moved money from the brokerage 3 days ago." She heard Mercer exhale, not dramatically. The exhale of a man recalibrating. "How much?" She told him. "Before we filed. he said. He moved it before we filed, which means he knew we were about to file. A silence that neither of them needed to fill with words, because the implication was already in the room between them. Someone in Mercer's office, or someone connected to the filing process, had told Lucian's side that the petition was coming. Not a public record, the filing itself was on the record, but the timing, the specific day, the window in which Lucian had moved to protect assets, that was information that should not have been available to him. Mercer, she kept her voice quiet. Someone told him. I don't know that yet. You moved the filing date up by 1 day. We discussed it on the phone Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, he had moved money. She pressed her palm flat on the table. Do the math. Another silence, longer this time. I will look into it, he said. I promise you. I will look into it. But right now I need you to take a screenshot of that account and send it to me immediately. That transfer is evidence of asset dissipation during contemplation of divorce, and it changes our motion response significantly. She took the screenshot and sent it. She sat for a long moment after, with the laptop open and the account page on the screen and the number that was now missing from the balance. And she thought about what Mercer had not said, but what was now circling the room regardless. The possibility that the 14th floor office, the beige waiting room, the legal team she had placed her trust in, had a seam in it that Lucien had found and used. She was careful. She was methodical. She had chosen Mercer specifically because of his reputation, because of the Delacroix case, because of the intelligence she had gathered before she ever walked into that office. And it was more than possible, that careful and methodical had not been enough, because Lucian had 5 years of watching her be careful and methodical and had spent that time building around it. She called Lauren Hayes. Lauren answered immediately. Are you somewhere private? Yes. Okay. A breath. What I'm about to tell you, I've been sitting on it because I wasn't sure if it was my place, and because frankly, I wasn't certain enough of it to say something that could blow up your life. A pause. I'm certain enough now. Amara waited. I know Serafina Vale, Lauren said. Not well. We move in overlapping circles. I've been in 4 or 5 rooms with her over the past 2 years. Another pause. She was at the benefit, the same one where Lucien talked to you about the closing. Something in Amara's chest went very still. She was there as a guest of Harlan Cross, Lauren continued. I noticed because she and Cross seemed not romantic, but closely connected, familiar in a specific way. I didn't think anything of it at the time because I didn't know who she was to you or who she was to Lucien. Her voice carried the particular weight of someone who has been carrying guilty information. Amara, I think Serafina and Harlan Cross knew each other well before she and Lucien became involved, which means she wasn't random, Amara said. I don't think so, no. The benefit, 18 months ago. The same event where Lucien had described the investment as a standard property structure. Serafina Vale, there as a guest of the man who would become a co-director of the LLC that Lucien would use to fund their affair. The LLC that would be formed 2 months later. The closing document that would be signed with Amara's unknowing signature 1 month after that. She was not looking at an affair. She was looking at a plan. Serafina Vale was not a woman Lucien had met and fallen into something with. She was, or had been presented as, a component of something that had been constructed deliberately, and Harlan Cross was in it, and Cross's brother's law firm was in it, and the notary who had stood at a closing table and accepted the title of attorney without correction was in it, and it had been running for at least 18 months, while Amara held things together from inside the marriage, protected his reputation, signed the documents he put in front of her. Lauren, her voice was something she barely recognized, too controlled. Controlled the way ice is controlled, structurally rigid right up until the temperature changes. I need you to write all of this down, everything you just told me, the benefit, seeing Serafina with Cross, the timeline. Send it to me and copy Adrian Mercer. Already started, Lauren said. Amara, are you? Fine, Amara said. Thank you. She ended the call. She sat at the table and did not move for a long time. The city noise came through the window, continuous and indifferent, the sound of 10,000 lives proceeding without knowledge of or interest in hers. She looked at her hands on the table, the watch on her left wrist. She unclasped it and set it on the table beside the laptop and looked at it lying there. The platinum case, the birthday gift from Lucien, purchased during a month that now had a different meaning. She thought about the benefit, about standing in that room, about asking Lucien about the closing timeline and listening to his answer and accepting it, the way she had accepted everything he told her because she had been a woman who believed that the person she chose to build a life with had also chosen her. She thought about the 9 lines on page 4. She thought about Serafina Vale standing across a room with Harlan Cross while Lucien stood beside his wife and described a property investment. She thought about the word plan. The door opened. Raven, home early. She came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw Amara's face, and she did not immediately speak, which was the right response. "Sit down," Amara said. Raven sat. Amara told her everything Lauren had said. She told it without inflection, without the emotional register that the information deserved, because she had put the emotion somewhere else temporarily, had moved it to a location she could return to later when she was not required to be functional. She watched Raven's face move through the stages: confusion, understanding, the slow, horrible arrival of the full picture. "He brought her into the room," Raven said quietly. "He brought her into the same room where you were standing." "Yes." While it was already being built, yes. Raven put both hands flat on the table. She was breathing hard through her nose. "Amara, this isn't—" She stopped. "This wasn't just cheating. This was—" "I know what it was. He used you. He used your trust and your money and your signature to build something he was already planning to use against you." "I know. So what do we— I need to think." Amara stood. She needed to be moving, needed the body doing something while the mind worked, because the implications were still arriving and they needed to be organized before she could act on them. She crossed to the window and stood there and looked at the city. The leak in Mercer's office. The money that moved before we filed. That has to be part of this too. How? Because Lucien is not a man who leaves things to chance. If he had already built the documents, already set up Cross, already arranged the legal response, he would also have arranged to know in advance when the petition was coming. He would have had someone watching the process. She turned from the window. "He's been 2 steps ahead of me since the night at the restaurant." "Then we have to get 3 steps ahead of him." Amara looked at her sister. "To do that, I need to know everyone he is using, not just Garrison, not just Cross, everyone." She looked back at the city. "I need someone inside his circle who is willing to talk." "That's a dangerous thing to look for." "I know." She stood at the window and thought about the past week. The petition, the counter-response, the document on page 4, the transfer, the leak, Lauren's voice on the phone saying, "I think Serafina and Harlan Cross knew each other well before." She thought about Lucien straightening his jacket at the restaurant. She thought about 18 months. And then, from somewhere she hadn't expected it, a name arrived. Not a friend, not someone she had ever particularly trusted, someone who existed on the margin of Lucien's world, who had been there for years, who had watched things accumulate. A man named Victor Rains, who had worked adjacent to Lucien's organization for 7 years, and whom Amara had seen twice in the past year in conversations with Lucien that ended the moment she entered the room. She had filed the observation and moved on. She was not moving on from it now. She turned from the window and picked up her phone and opened a browser and searched for a number she was not certain she had. And while she searched, she was already thinking about what she would say and what she would offer, and what it meant that she was now in the position of approaching a man from Lucien's world with a request for information that could unravel everything Lucien had built. Not just the marriage, not just the financial structures, but the broader architecture of an organization that had survived for a decade on the premise that the people inside it stayed inside it. She was about to step across a line she could not step back over. She found the number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She thought of page 4 and the 9 lines, and her own signature beneath them. She pressed call. Victor Rains picked up on the 3rd ring. He said nothing when he answered. Just silence, the kind that asks the caller to identify themselves and explain the intrusion simultaneously. Victor. Amara kept her voice level. It's Amara Whitfield, formerly Voss. A pause. Then, Mrs. Voss. He used the old name deliberately, which told her something, either habit or a test of how she responded to it. Whitfield, she said, I need 20 minutes, not on the phone. Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him breathing, and behind his breathing something ambient, machinery or ventilation, a working environment rather than a home. That's a complicated request. I know what it is. I'm making it anyway. And if I'm not interested in complicated right now, then you're not interested. She kept her voice flat. But I think you've been watching what's been happening for the past 2 weeks, and I think you have your own reasons for finding it relevant. And I think you know that what I'm asking for is a conversation, not a commitment. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might simply hang up. Then, tomorrow, 11, the Caldwell Building, 4th floor. There's a firm called Greystone Consulting. Use that name at the desk. He paused. Come alone. The line went dead. She lowered the phone and found Raven watching her from across the table with an expression that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. You called Victor Rains, Raven said. Yes. He works for us. He works adjacent to. There's a difference. Not if things go wrong, there isn't. Amara looked at her sister steadily. Things are already wrong. The question now is whether they get worse on his terms or mine. She picked up the legal pad. I need you to write down everything you remember about the benefit. Tonight. I'll take it to Mercer in the morning before I go to the Caldwell. Raven held her gaze for a moment longer, and then she reached for the pen without another word because she understood, had always understood, that there came a point in certain situations where argument was a luxury that cost more than it returned. Amara did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow guest bed and ran the architecture of the past 18 months through her mind repeatedly, not with anguish, but with the methodical attention of someone looking for the load-bearing points, the places where the structure Lucian had built was weakest. Cross and Serafina at the benefit, the notary at the closing, the leak from Mercer's process. The money that had moved 3 days before the petition. She arranged these facts the way you arrange pieces on a table before you understand what they form, looking for the pattern under the pattern. By 4 in the morning, she had something that was not yet certainty, but was close enough to act on. Mercer's office at 8:30. She arrived before his assistant, waited in the beige hall, and when he appeared, he took one look at her face and skipped the pleasantries. You found something, he said. 2 things. She followed him into the office and sat and put the legal pad on his desk. First, Raven's account of the benefit conversation, written and dated. Second, and more important, she leaned forward, the leak in your process. I think it was the filing date change. He sat down slowly. Explain. You moved the petition date up by 1 day. You made that decision on a Wednesday afternoon phone call. By Thursday morning, Lucian had initiated a wire transfer from the brokerage. She watched his face. Who knew about the date change besides you and me? Mercer was quiet. She could see him going through it. The internal accounting of who had been present, who had been copied, who had been informed. Has been copied. Who had been informed. His jaw tightened slightly. Petra handled the rescheduling internally. She would have notified the court clerk's office, which is standard process. And before the court clerk, my associate Davis, he was coordinating the filing documents. A pause. The tightening increased. He's been with the firm 4 years. Find out who Davis talks to, Amara said, outside the office, who he is connected to socially, professionally. I think you'll find something. Mercer looked at her with an expression that was complicated. The discomfort of a man being told there may be a problem inside something he built and is responsible for. That's a serious implication. I know what it is. I'm making it anyway. She used the same word she had used with Victor Rains, and Mercer caught it, and something in his expression resolved into a harder line. I'll look into it today. Do it quietly. She stood. and I need you to file an emergency motion contesting the account restriction order. Everything we have on the asset dissipation, the brokerage transfer, the timing, the documentation from Webb. File it this morning. I was already planning to. File it before noon. She left his office and took a cab to the Caldwell building and rode the elevator to the 4th floor and gave the name Greystone Consulting to the woman at the reception desk, who made a brief call and then directed her down a corridor to a room that was smaller than an office and larger than a closet, with 2 chairs and a table and no windows. The kind of room that communicated deliberately that no record of this conversation would be produced. Victor Raines was already there. He was a compact man in his late 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in environments where sudden movement carried consequences. He was not handsome and not threatening in any obvious way. He was the kind of man you forgot you had seen, which Amara understood now was probably not accidental. He did not stand when she entered. He looked at her with the direct calibrating attention of someone taking inventory. "Whitfield," he said, testing the name. "Yes." She sat. "Thank you for coming." "I haven't agreed to anything." He put his hands on the table, palms down, relaxed. "Talk." She talked. She gave him the condensed architecture, the document on page 4, the cross-connection, the LLC, the benefit, Lauren's account of Serafina's presence there, the brokerage transfer and its timing, the possible leak from Mercer's associate. She gave it to him in the same flat, informational register she had used with Mercer, without appealing to his sympathy, because she did not believe Victor Raines made decisions based on sympathy. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. "Why come to me?" "Because you've been inside Lucian's world long enough to know where the seams are, and because I've watched you leave 2 rooms in the past year when I entered them, which tells me there are conversations happening that Lucian doesn't want me to be part of, and I want to know what's in them." "Watching the rooms," he said. Not a compliment, not a criticism, just acknowledgement. "I've had 5 years of practice." He looked at her for a long moment. "What are you offering?" "Whatever information I have access to that's useful to you. I know the financial structures better than anyone outside his organization. Webb has documented $2.5 million in traceable movement. There's more he hasn't found yet." She held his gaze. "I think you already know what Cross has been doing with Lucian's capital, and I think you know it goes further than the LLC." Something shifted in Raines's expression. Very small. The micro-movement of a man whose estimation of a situation has just been revised. "You're not asking me to testify," he said. "No, I'm asking you to tell me what's in the rooms I wasn't allowed in." He looked at the table again. His right thumb moved once across the back of his left hand, a small private gesture, the kind people make when they're running a calculation they don't want visible. Then he looked up. "Harlan Cross has been moving Lucian's capital into 3 structures that have nothing to do with the LLC you know about. The LLC was the visible layer. What's underneath it? That's not about an affair. That's operational funding, the kind that doesn't survive legal discovery without taking down people who are considerably more dangerous than Lucian Voss." She kept her face still. "How much?" "Enough that Garrison isn't just protecting Lucian's divorce settlement. He's protecting the architecture under the marriage." Raines paused. "The reason your husband wanted to discredit the financial claims isn't about what you can prove. It's about what pulling on that thread might expose. He is not fighting you, Miss Whitfield. He is fighting everything behind you." The room was very quiet. "Does Serafina know what she's part of?" Amara said. "She knows enough. Not everything." He paused. "She's gone, by the way. Left the city 4 days ago. Someone informed her that the legal process was going to involve her name explicitly, and she decided the mafia lifestyle looked less attractive once it came with a deposition." Amara thought about that. About Lucian. The man who had installed Serafina in hotel suites, who had apparently embedded her in a structure that was bigger than either of them had made visible, who was now conducting a legal war on 2 fronts, and who was doing all of it while his center was collapsing. She felt nothing about Serafina's departure that resembled satisfaction. What she felt was closer to clarity, the removal of one complicating variable. "Victor?" She leaned forward slightly. "Is there documentation of the deeper structures?" He looked at her for a long time. "There is." And is it somewhere Lucian doesn't control? The pause that followed was the most significant one of the conversation. It's somewhere he thinks he controls, Rain said, which is different. She held his gaze. I need access to what you have, or I need you to direct it somewhere it can be used. If I do that, he said carefully, it doesn't just affect Lucian. You understand that. I understand. People above Lucian in this structure, people who are not going to respond to legal exposure the way a man responds when his divorce is going badly. I understand what I'm asking. He studied her face. She kept it even, kept it clear, and gave him nothing to read except the resolution she had arrived at somewhere between page 4 of the closing document and 4 in the morning in Raven's guest room. The resolution that said there was no version of this that was safe, and she had been trying to find the safe version, and the safe version did not exist, and the only remaining question was whether she proceeded anyway. I'll make a call, Rain said. He pushed back from the table and stood. I'm not a witness. I'm not a source. I'm someone who made a phone call. He looked at her with something that was not warmth, but was a form of respect that was, from this man in this room, more valuable. Get a better security arrangement than your sister's 4th-floor apartment. He left. She sat in the windowless room for 4 minutes after he walked out, organizing what she now knew into what she needed to do with it. And then she stood and smoothed her jacket and walked back down the corridor and through the gray stone reception and into the elevator and pressed the lobby button and stood with her hands at her sides and her pulse running faster than she wanted it to. Mercer called when she was 2 blocks from the Caldwell. Davis, he said. His voice was flat. His partner's brother-in-law works for a financial consulting firm that has done advisory work for 2 of Lucian's legitimate-facing entities. It's not direct. It's 1 step removed, but it's enough, Amar said. Yes. Can you contain it? I've already asked Davis to take immediate leave. He didn't argue, which tells me he knew I'd find it. A pause. Amara, he didn't pass case information deliberately, I don't think. I think he mentioned the filing change to someone he trusted, and that someone passed it without his knowledge. It doesn't change the result, but it changes the... It doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is it's contained now. She kept walking. File the emergency motion. And Mercer, when you file, I need you to include a request for expedited financial discovery. Full scope. Not just the LLC. Deeper. Silence. That's a significant escalation. I know what it is. Another pause. If we go that deep in discovery, Garrison will move to challenge on relevance grounds. It could get... File it! He filed it. The response from Garrison's office came at 3:17 that afternoon. Not through the court process, not through the formal channels, but through a phone call to Mercer's office from Garrison himself, which Mercer relayed to Amara in a voice that was carefully neutral. He wants a meeting, Mercer said. In person. Lucian, you, both attorneys. He's framing it as a settlement discussion. When? He said tomorrow. She thought about Rains in the windowless room. He thinks he controls it. Tell him yes. Amara, I want to advise caution about a direct tell him yes. Set it for 10 in the morning. Garrison's office. She paused. And Mercer. Tell him we're bringing forensic documentation. Full scope. Tell him that explicitly when you confirm. A silence. Then, you want him to know what we're bringing. I want Lucian to spend tonight understanding exactly what walks into that room tomorrow. She ended the call and stood on the sidewalk in the afternoon cold and looked at the city around her, the pedestrians, the traffic, the indifferent machinery of a world that continued regardless. And she allowed herself for 30 seconds to feel the full weight of what was in motion. The expedited discovery. The deeper structures. Whatever Rains was going to direct toward them through channels she couldn't track and hadn't asked to track. The meeting tomorrow. All of it moving now, all of it irreversible, the momentum of the past 2 weeks compressing into the next 18 hours. Then she hailed a cab. She spent the evening at Raven's table preparing. Webb sent updated documentation. 3 additional transaction chains he had traced after Amar's direction to go deeper. Mercer sent the filed emergency motion and the discovery request. Lauren Hayes sent her written account of the benefit, precise and detailed, exactly what a woman who had navigated serious rooms knew how to produce. Raven sat across the table and read through everything as it arrived, and said very little, and twice refilled Amara's coffee without being asked. At 11 that night, a message arrived from a number Amara did not recognize. No name. A single line of text with a file attached. She opened the file. It took her 9 minutes to understand what she was looking at, and then she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and let out a slow breath that was not relief and was not victory, but was the specific exhalation of a person who has just seen the full board for the first time. Raven. Her voice was quiet. Raven looked up. I need you to forward this to Mercer. Right now, tonight. She turned the laptop so her sister could see the screen. Don't read it. Just send it. Raven looked at the screen. Her face went through something complicated. Where did this come from? Someone who made a phone call. Raven looked at her. Is this going to be enough? It's going to be more than enough. Amara closed the laptop. That's what I'm worried about. She did not sleep at all. At 9:40 the following morning, she stood in the elevator of Garrison's building in a charcoal suit she had borrowed from Raven, slightly too long in the sleeve, which she had folded once with precise care. With Mercer beside her and a leather portfolio under her arm containing printed copies of Webb's documentation, Lauren's account, Raven's written statement, the emergency motion, and the contents of the file that had arrived at 11 the previous night. Mercer had read the file at midnight and called her at 12:15. This implicates people outside the marriage, he had said. Yes. Significantly outside. Yes. If this becomes part of the discovery record, I know what it does. A long silence. You're sure you want to use this? I want Lucian to see that I have it, she said. What he does after that is his choice. The elevator reached the 22nd floor. The doors opened into a reception area that communicated money and aggression in equal measure. Dark wood, hard angles, the kind of aesthetic that said the people behind these walls won more than they lost and intended for you to feel that before you sat down. A young associate in a dark suit met them and led them down a corridor to a conference room with a long glass table and a view of the city that was probably designed to remind visitors how high up they were. Garrison was already there, 60, silver-haired, the kind of physical confidence that came from decades of being the most prepared person in difficult rooms. He stood when they entered and shook Mercer's hand with the ease of men who opposed each other professionally and maintained the surface of civility because it was more efficient. He looked at Amara and nodded. Ms. Whitfield. Mr. Garrison. She sat. And then Lucian came in. He entered from a side door she hadn't noticed, which meant he had been in a back room, waiting or being briefed or both. He wore a dark suit and he looked like himself, which was the first thing she registered because she had been preparing herself for some visible diminishment and it had not arrived. He looked controlled. He looked like a man who had survived difficult mornings before and expected to survive this one. He sat across from her. For the first time since the restaurant, they were in the same room. She did not look away from him and he did not look away from her, and the conference room held the specific charge of two people who had once occupied the same bed and now occupied opposite sides of a glass table, and between them was 5 years and 18 months and page 4 of a closing document and a file that had arrived at 11 the previous night. Garrison spoke first. We're here because both parties have expressed interest in a resolution that avoids prolonged litigation. My client is prepared to discuss. Before we discuss anything, Amara said, I want your client to understand what we've brought into this room. Garrison looked at her. Ms. Whitfield, the purpose of this, Mercer. She opened the portfolio and slid a document across the table to Mercer, who slid it to Garrison without speaking. Page 1 is Webb's full forensic documentation. 3 LLC structures, not one. 17 months of transactions. The specific capital movements and their origins. She watched Garrison's eyes move across the page and kept her own eyes on Lucian. Page 2 is the account of the benefit. 2 witnesses who placed Serafina Vale with Harlan Cross at the same event where Lucian described the investment property to me as a simple property purchase. 18 months ago. Lucian's jaw shifted, just slightly. Page 3. She slid another document. The closing notary, Drew Parrish, his notarization history across Lucian's network. 11 documents in 14 months, she paused. And page 4. She placed the last document on the table. She watched Garrison pick it up. She watched his face, which was composed and professional, and then, approximately 8 seconds into reading, was something else. He controlled it immediately, smoothed it back into professional composure, but she had seen it. The 8-second window when Daniel Garrison, who had been in more difficult rooms than this one, understood what he was holding. He set the document down. He looked at Lucian. Lucian looked at the document. She watched him read it. Watched him move through the first paragraph, the second. Watched the stillness she knew so well become a different kind of stillness. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing a situation, but the absolute stillness of a man who has just understood that the situation is no longer manageable. He looked up at her. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "Does it matter?" Amara. The use of her name without any other words. Not a threat, not a demand. The voice of a man who was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, simply speaking to her without strategy. "You built something," she said, "behind our marriage, behind the LLC, behind Cross, behind everything I could see. You built it, and you used my signature and my money and 5 years of my silence to help hold it together." She kept her voice level. "I'm not angry about it anymore. I was. I'm not now." She looked at him directly. "I want what I'm owed. I want the full settlement that reflects the full contribution I made to your empire, visible and invisible. I want the asset restriction order dismissed. I want the counterpetition withdrawn. And I want it done before we leave this building." Garrison started to speak. "Miss Whitfield, what you're proposing—" "I'm not proposing," she said. She did not look at Garrison. She looked at Lucian. "I'm telling your client what happens if he agrees, and I'm letting him think about what happens if he doesn't." She paused. "You have people above you who are in that file. People who have been in your structures for longer than I've been in your marriage. If this goes to full discovery, if the expedited motion is granted, which Mercer filed yesterday morning, they become visible." She let that sit. "I don't want them visible. I want my settlement." The conference room was completely silent. Outside the glass wall, the city moved in the distance, indifferent and continuous, 22 floors below the specific weight of this silence. Lucian looked at her for a long time. She watched him. The gray eyes, the jaw, the hands flat on the glass table, the man she had dressed beside and eaten beside and held her breath beside in rooms that required it, the man who had called her unforgettable and then forgotten her, who had built a trap inside their marriage and been surprised, perhaps, when she had found the tool to break it. He looked at her, and she held his gaze without flinching, without softening, without any of the accommodations she had spent 5 years making automatically. "Give us the room," Lucian said. Garrison looked at him. "Lucian, I strongly advise, give us the room, Daniel." Mercer looked at Amara. She gave him a single small nod. They stood and left, and the associate outside pulled the conference room door closed behind them, and Amara sat alone across the glass table from the most feared man in the city, with the file between them and the view of the city behind him, and the silence of a room where everything that was going to decide the rest of her life was about to be said. Lucian looked at the file. He did not touch it. "You could have destroyed me with this," he said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She looked at him. "Because I'm not trying to destroy you, Lucian. I never was." She paused. "I'm trying to leave." He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most, his hands on the table, the city behind him. "The people in that file," he said carefully, "you understand they don't respond to legal exposure the way—" "I know exactly who they are," she said, "which means you know I understand exactly what holding this file costs me, and I'm sitting here anyway." He looked at her. Something moved behind the storm gray eyes. Not the flicker she had seen at the restaurant, which had been guilt masquerading as composure, but something different, something she had not seen in 5 years and maybe had never seen. He reached for the file. She put her hand on top of it. "Settlement first," she said. The silence between them was the longest of the morning, and the morning had been full of long silences, and she sat inside this one with her hand on the file and her spine straight and her breathing controlled, and she did not move, and she did not look away. And for the first time in the 5 years she had known Lucian Voss, for the first time in all the dinners and rooms and silences, and one devastating sentence across a white linen tablecloth, she watched the most feared man in the city lower his eyes first. He reached for his phone. "Get Garrison back in here," he said. Garrison came back into the room with the careful walk of a man who had been told something in the corridor that had rearranged his understanding of the morning. Mercer followed. He sat beside Amara without speaking and opened his portfolio and took out a pen and held it above a clean page, and his stillness communicated that he was ready for whatever came next. Garrison sat beside Lucian. Lucian had not moved during the 4 minutes they were out of the room. He was in the same position, hands on the glass table, eyes forward. But something in the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of strategy. It was the stillness of a man who has reached the bottom of a calculation and found that the number there is not what he planned for. "My client," Garrison began, and then stopped, which was unusual enough that both Mercer and Amara looked at him. He cleared his throat. "My client is prepared to discuss the terms of an amended settlement framework." Amara did not move. "Not a framework, terms." Garrison looked at Lucian. Lucian gave him a small nod that communicated something they had apparently decided in the corridor. "Terms," Garrison said. What followed took 3 hours and 40 minutes. She had not expected it to be clean, and it was not clean. Garrison was still Garrison. Even working within parameters his client had apparently conceded. He found every edge, tested every boundary, inserted language that required Mercer to pause and read with the focused attention of a man searching for machinery hidden in the words. Twice the room went silent for long stretches, while the two attorneys negotiated specific clauses in lowered voices, trading technical language back and forth across the table like men working a mechanism neither wanted to break completely. Amara sat through all of it. She did not speak unless she was addressed. She kept her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she watched Lucian during the silences. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction she had imagined might be present if she ever arrived at a moment like this, but with the specific attention of someone trying to see a thing clearly for the first time after having seen it wrong for a long time. He did not look like a defeated man. She needed to be accurate about that. He looked like a man who had made a decision at a cost he understood and was absorbing the cost without performing the absorption for anyone's benefit. There was something almost, she reached for the word carefully, respectable about it. Not admirable, not forgivable, but respectable, in the specific way that a person can be respectable even inside their damage. She thought about that, and then she put it away because she could not afford it yet. The settlement was not everything she had asked for in the abstract. It was everything that mattered. The asset restriction order dropped before noon. Garrison drafted the withdrawal himself, which communicated something about how thoroughly the file had adjusted his position. The counterpetition withdrawn. The financial settlement structured to reflect the full scope of her contribution to the marital estate, including the inherited capital that had been routed through the closing document, including compensation for the 18 months of documented misuse. Webb's figures formed the baseline. The final number was significantly above it. The LLC and its associated structures were not part of the formal record. That was the trade. Amara had known it would be. The people in the file, the layer beneath Lucian, the names that Rains had directed toward her through the 11 o'clock message, they remained unlit. She had used them as the shape of the threat without deploying them as the substance of it, and that distinction would need to be enough, because she was not prepared to pay what full exposure of those names would cost, and she was not certain anyone was. She understood this was the imperfection at the center of what she was walking away with. She had thought about it clearly in the 4 minutes when Garrison and Mercer were out of the room, and she had concluded that imperfect and alive was a better outcome than righteous and something else. She was at peace with it, or she would be, eventually. For now, she simply understood it. At 2:14 in the afternoon, both parties signed. Mercer gathered the documents with the unhurried precision of a man for whom this moment was professional rather than personal, though she had noticed, when he looked at her after the final signature, that his expression carried something warmer than professional satisfaction. He had, she thought, genuinely believed she would be able to do this. She found that she was glad someone had. She stood, Garrison stood, Lucian stood. The associate appeared at the door to collect the signing materials. Garrison shook Mercer's hand. He looked at Amara and said, with the brief acknowledgement of a man who does not offer many, "Ms. Whitfield." She returned the nod. Lucian picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He did not put it on immediately. He held it for a moment, and she watched him in profile. The jaw, the gray at his temple that had not been there 5 years ago, the scar along the inside of his left forearm that was not from a car accident when he was 19. "Amara," he said. She waited. He turned to look at her, and his face was unguarded, in a way she had rarely seen it, in a way that felt, at this moment in this conference room with the signed documents on the table, like something she had not expected to be offered and was not sure what to do with. "I want to say something, not for the record, not—" He stopped, chose. "I want to say it because I think you've earned someone saying it to your face." Mercer moved slightly, a professional instinct to interject. She touched his arm briefly, and he stopped. "What I built inside our marriage," Lucian said. "What I used you for. The document, the capital, the way I let you hold things together while I was—" He stopped again. "I don't have language for what that cost you that isn't inadequate. I know that. I'm not asking you to receive an apology as though it changes the math." He paused. "I just want you to know that I knew what you were worth from the beginning. I chose to use it instead of honor it. That's on me, not on anything you did or failed to do." She looked at him. The conference room held the two of them inside this, and she let it be what it was. Not a reconciliation, not a performance of magnanimity, but two people at the end of something that had cost them both more than either had planned for. "I know," she said. It was the truest thing she could have said, and she said it without cruelty and without softness, just as fact, and he heard it that way. And something in his face settled into a kind of acceptance that was the closest thing to peace she had ever seen on him. He put on his jacket. He walked out of the conference room without looking back, and she stood and watched the door close behind him, and she breathed in once and out once, and that was the end of 5 years. The November air outside Garrison's building was cold and clean and indifferent, the way weather is indifferent, the way cities continue. Mercer walked her to the street and shook her hand and told her he would have the final documentation to her within the week, and she thanked him with the directness she had used with him throughout. No excess, just genuine acknowledgement of work that had been hard and had mattered. He had earned that. She did not spend it cheaply. She called Raven from the sidewalk. "It's done," she said. She heard her sister stop breathing for a moment, then a sound that was not quite a word. Then, "Come home." She took a cab to Raven's building and went upstairs, and Raven opened the door before she knocked and did not say anything, and neither did she. And they stood in the doorway for a moment that did not need language. And then she came inside and sat at the table that had held so much of the past 2 weeks, and put her hands flat on the wood and looked at them. They were not shaking. She noticed that, filed it without ceremony. Raven made coffee. Amara sat with it and felt, for the first time since the restaurant, the specific and peculiar lightness of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has set it down. Not the joy of relief, not the clean release of resolution, but the disorienting absence of weight, the body taking a moment to remember how to hold itself upright without the load. She thought about what she was going to do next. Not immediately, not that afternoon, but the question was there, and it was real, and it was hers, which was itself a new thing. A question that was entirely hers to answer, without management, without adjustment to another person's requirements, without the constant background calculation of what the most feared man in the city needed the evening to look like. She thought about the studio she had abandoned, before Lucian, before the marriage, before the slow rearrangement of herself around the requirements of his world. She had been a designer, not hobbyist, working. Small firm, her own clients, the particular satisfaction of making something from nothing and watching it function in the world. She had dissolved the practice 18 months into the marriage, at Lucien's suggestion, framed as practical. You don't need to work, and the clients require availability I can't always accommodate, and you're so much more present here. She had told herself she was making a choice. She understood now that she had been being managed. The work was still in her. She had felt it occasionally at odd moments, the muscle memory of a skill that had been rested too long. She had not fed it. She had not trusted it. She had told herself the time had passed. She did not believe that anymore. 3 days after the signing, a message arrived from Lauren Hayes. Lauren had been present throughout the past week in the specific way she was present at everything, at a useful angle, providing what was needed without requiring direction. Amara had registered this and had not yet fully processed what it meant about Lauren as a person versus Lauren as a contact. The message was brief. I'd like to have lunch. Not about any of this. About what comes next. If you're ready for what comes next. She stared at it for a moment. Then she typed back, Tuesday. Lauren was already at the restaurant when she arrived, a small place in the arts district that Amara would not have known Lucien's world, and that felt, for that reason alone, like clean air. She slid into the seat across from Lauren, and they ordered and sat with each other for a moment without the weight of the past week's information exchange. And it was different than she expected. Easier. Lauren Hayes, without the urgent functional context, was a woman who was funny in a dry, specific way, and who listened without the performance of listening, who made eye contact like someone with nothing to prove. I've been watching you for 2 years, Lauren said when their food arrived. In those rooms, the way you moved through them. She shook her head slightly. I kept thinking, this woman has no idea what she is. Amara looked at her. I had some idea. Not enough of one. Lauren cut into her food without looking at the plate. What did you do before him? She told her. The design practice, the clients, the work she had been good at, the decision to dissolve it that she had told herself was a choice. Lauren listened and nodded in the specific way of someone who is not just hearing but building something out of what they're hearing. I run a strategy firm, Lauren said. You know that. What you may not know is that I've been trying to expand into creative direction for 2 years, and I haven't found the right partner because most of the candidates are talented but not resilient, or resilient but not talented, and the specific combination of those two things is rarer than you'd think. She looked at Amara directly. You've just demonstrated that you have both, under conditions that would have broken a significant percentage of people I've met in 30 years of professional life. I don't want to put you on a list for consideration. I want to know if you're interested in building something. Amara looked back at her. She felt the offer settle into her chest, not with the relief of rescue, because this was not rescue. She did not need rescue. She had just proven that in a conference room on the 22nd floor, but with the recognition of something that was the right size and shape for the space she was now carrying. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. What Lauren was thinking was specific and detailed and had clearly been organized in advance of this lunch, which Amara respected. A creative strategy firm. Hayes Whitfield, she said, if Amara agreed to the name, putting Amara's name on the door because Lauren understood instinctively that a partnership required both names to be visible or it was not a partnership. Clients Lauren had already, clients they would build toward, a studio space Lauren had her eye on in the district, a structure that gave Amara equity from day one rather than salary, because Lauren did not think in the language of employment when she was talking about something she considered genuinely shared. You don't have to decide today, Lauren said. I'm deciding today, Amara said. Lauren looked at her. Then the dry humor arrived at the corner of her mouth. There she is, she said quietly. Hayes Whitfield Creative opened its doors 6 weeks after the signing, in a studio on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like plaster and coffee and the specific dusty promise of spaces not yet used for their purpose. Amara spent 2 days arranging the studio before they took on the first client, moving furniture with her jacket off and her hair pulled back, making decisions about light and space and sight lines with the ease of a woman returning to a language she had been fluent in and had only stopped speaking, not forgotten. It did not feel like starting over. It felt like resuming. The first months were not easy. She did not pretend to herself that they were. There were evenings when the studio was empty and the work was piling, and the financial adjustment of a life rebuilt from the settlement rather than the ongoing provision of an empire required the specific discipline of someone who had previously lived without financial vigilance. She was good at discipline. She applied it without self-pity and without drama, and it held. Raven came to the studio sometimes in the evenings and sat on the worn couch near the window and read while Amara worked, and they existed in the comfortable parallel quiet of people who have been through something together that they do not need to continuously reference. Occasionally Raven would look up and say something, and occasionally Amara would respond, and occasionally they would say nothing for an hour, and that was also correct. Marcus Webb sent her a final accounting report 8 weeks after the signing. She read it with the attention she gave to everything, and at the end of it, when the numbers were clear and the structures accounted for, and the full picture of what had been moved and recovered was visible, she sat for a while with the document on her desk and did not perform any particular feeling about it. She simply knew. The knowing was enough. She did not think about Lucian often. When she did, it was without the heat of the months before, without the anger that had arrived at 2 a.m. in Raven's guest room, without the cold fury of reading page 4 of the closing document. What she thought, when she thought about him at all, was something more like accuracy. She saw him clearly. She had probably never seen him clearly while they were together. Because proximity obscures, because when you have organized your life around a person, you cannot simultaneously see the full shape of what you have organized it around. Distance clarified. What she saw clearly and without revision was a man who had been afraid, in some central way, of the same vulnerability that he had used to define her. He had controlled everything he could reach because he could not tolerate what he could not control, and he had looked at her love and seen something that needed to be managed rather than something that could be trusted, and that failure of perception had cost them both. She did not forgive him. That was too large a word for something that was not finished metabolizing, but she also did not carry it. She had enough to carry that was worth carrying. Victor Raines called once, 6 weeks after the conference room. A brief call, businesslike, checking that the settlement had been completed without residual complications. She understood this was also a check that the file had not been deployed beyond its use as leverage. She confirmed both things. He said, in the tone he had used in the windowless room, "Good." Then, "You handled that well." She said, "I know." He almost laughed. She was not certain, but she thought for half a second he almost did. The call ended, and she never heard from him again. Serafina Vale's name surfaced once more in a piece of financial reporting in a local publication 6 months later, a brief mention in a story about entities connected to a downtown development dispute. The name Harlan Cross appeared in the same paragraph. Amara read it once and noted the absence of Lucian's name and turned the page. Whatever had reconstituted itself in the wake of the conference room, it had reconstituted outside her perimeter. She was content for that to remain true. The thing she had not anticipated in all the careful preparation and documentation and strategic movement of the preceding months was what it would feel like to work again. Not the satisfaction of it, she had remembered that, had counted on it, but the specific texture of mornings when she woke with a problem that was hers to solve, a creative problem, a problem that existed in the domain of what she was genuinely good at rather than the domain of survival. She had been operating for months in the language of survival, and survival was necessary and she had been adequate to it, but it was not the language she was built for. Design was the language she was built for. The consideration of form and function and the human experience of moving through spaces and objects and communications that had been made with intelligence and intention. She had forgotten, not the skill, but the joy underneath the skill, the reason she had wanted to do this work in the first place. The thing that had existed before the gallery opening, before the man in the charcoal suit who had crossed an entire room to tell her she looked unforgettable. She was remembering it now. 4 months after the studio opened, she and Lauren sat at the work table at the end of a day that had run long and successful and exhausting, with takeout containers between them and project files spread across the surface, and Lauren leaned back in her chair and looked at the room and said, "This is working." "Yes," Amara said. "It's going to keep working." Amara looked around the studio. The quality of the late light coming through the windows, the boards on the wall with the current project's development spread across them, The coffee ring on the corner of her desk from that morning, the small evidence of an ongoing practice, a life in motion. Yes, she said again. I think it is. Lauren looked at her. Are you okay? Not professionally, actually okay. She thought about that honestly, which Lauren deserved. She thought about the restaurant and the emerald dress and the candle between the crystal glasses. She thought about Raven's guest room and 4 in the morning and the first time she pressed her palm flat on a table to stop her hand from shaking. She thought about the windowless room at the Caldwell building and the conference room on the 22nd floor and the moment Lucian lowered his eyes first. She thought about what she was now, relative to what she had been, and whether the distance between those two things could be measured in something other than loss. I'm getting there, she said, which was true, which was more honest than fine and more accurate than broken. That's enough for now. Lauren nodded once and went back to the project file, and Amara picked up her pen and made a note in the margin of the design brief in front of her, and the studio held them both in the useful quiet of people doing work that matters. And outside the window, the city moved through its evening with the indifference of a city, and the lights came on in the buildings across the street one by one as the sky shifted from gray to the particular dark blue that preceded full dark. And Amara looked up once at the window and watched it without naming what she felt about it. Some things did not require naming to be true. 7 months after the signing, on a Tuesday evening, she went back to set. Not with intention, or perhaps with intention she had not fully acknowledged. She had been in the neighborhood for a client meeting that ran late, and she was walking toward the main avenue for a cab, and she turned a corner and the black door was there, the brass handle, the small rectangle of light in the transom window above it, the same quiet presence on the same side street. She stopped. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the door and thought about the last time she had passed through it in the other direction, the emerald dress and the $200 bills on the white linen and the cold air on the sidewalk that had felt like something honest. She remembered standing there waiting for Raven's car and holding herself together with both hands on the inside. She reached for the brass handle and opened the door. The maitre d' looked up. He recognized her. She saw it in the brief movement of his expression, the professional recalibration. And to his credit, his recovery was immediate and graceful. Good evening, table for one? Yes, she said, whatever you have. He gave her a small table near the window. Not the table from before. She was glad for that. She sat and ordered a glass of wine. Not the Barolo, something lighter, something chosen entirely for herself without reference to anyone else's preference. And she sat with it in the warm light of the restaurant and listened to the low music and the murmur of other people's evenings, and she let herself be in the room. She thought about what she had believed. The last time she was here, she was celebrating. She had been wrong about what there was to celebrate. She had been celebrating the wrong thing and the wrong person, and a version of her life that was built on an accommodation so long-standing she had stopped being able to see it. The thing she had built in the months since, Hayes Whitfield, the studio, the mornings that were hers, the language she was built for, that was something to celebrate. Not loudly, not in the way of people who needed an audience for their recoveries. But here, quietly, with a glass of wine on a Tuesday evening in the same restaurant where the wreckage had started. She raised the glass slightly. Not a toast to anyone, just an acknowledgement, private and precise, of the distance traveled and the cost of it, and the fact that she was sitting here on the other side of it, intact, in possession of herself in a way she had not been in 5 years, perhaps longer. She drank. She stayed for an hour. She ate, unhurriedly, and she did not check her phone except once, to confirm a meeting time for the morning, and she sat with her own company in the restaurant, and it was not lonely. That was the thing she registered most clearly, the absence of loneliness in her own company. She had been lonely in the marriage, had not let herself name it while she was in it, but she had been. She was not lonely now. She paid her own bill. She left Sete and walked out into the night, and the city received her the way cities receive everyone, without ceremony, without recognition, as simply another person in the ongoing flow of lives. And she walked toward the avenue with her coat buttoned and her hands in her pockets and the cold air doing what cold air does. And she thought about the morning and the meeting and the project brief with her note in the margin, and she thought about Raven and Lauren and the light in the studio at the end of a long, useful day, and she thought about what she was walking toward. She did not think about what she was walking away from. That chapter had enough words already. Somewhere across the city, in buildings she would not visit and rooms she was no longer part of, other things were continuing. Lucian Voss was continuing, in whatever form a man continues after the ground beneath him shifts. The people in the file were continuing. The city's invisible architecture of obligation and leverage and power was continuing, as it always had, as it would after all of them were finished. She was not part of that anymore. She had paid to not be part of it, had paid in 5 years and 2 months of documentation and 3 hours and 40 minutes at a glass table, and the specific cost of standing in a windowless room and making a request that carried its own weight, its own danger, its own imperfection that she would sit with honestly for the rest of her life. Nothing had been free. She had not expected it to be. What she had not expected, what she was still, 7 months later, adjusting to, was the quality of the life on the other side of the cost, the texture of mornings, the satisfaction of problems that were hers, the ease, growing incrementally, of being fully present in her own existence rather than partially present in someone else's. The emerald dress hung in the back of her new closet now. She had not worn it since the restaurant, and she would not wear it again, but she had not thrown it out either. She was honest with herself about why. It was the dress from the night someone crossed a room and called her unforgettable, and that moment had been real, even if everything that followed it had been complicated, and she was not going to perform a simplicity about it that she did not feel. She would keep the dress. She would not be haunted by it. A cab appeared at the corner, and she raised her hand, and it pulled over, and she got in and gave her address. Her address. The apartment she had taken 3 months after the signing. The first place she had lived alone in 6 years, with windows that faced east and caught the morning light in a way she had not known she needed until she had it. The cab moved into traffic. She looked out the window at the city going past. In 3 weeks, Hayes Whitfield had a presentation to a client who could change the trajectory of the firm in a significant way. And she had 4 days of design work between now and then that she was genuinely looking forward to. And Raven was coming for dinner on Saturday, and there was a book on her nightstand she was 50 pages into and wanted to finish. And the apartment had a kitchen she was learning to use with the same focused attention she gave to everything she decided mattered. These were small things. She had learned, at a cost she would not have chosen, that small things were the architecture of everything. The cab moved north through the city, and the lights came through the window in intervals, steady and unremarkable, and she sat in the back of the cab, and she was Amara Whitfield, and she was on her way home.